The elevator doors closed on the only home she had ever bought with her own money, and Celeste Harrington did not cry. She was 75, wearing the same navy cashmere coat she had worn to her husband's memorial 12 years earlier, carrying nothing but a Hermes Kelly bag and the deed to the penthouse folded inside a Tiffany blue envelope older than her daughter's marriage. The doorman, Carlos, had looked away when her daughter, Victoria, hissed, "Mother, just stay in the guest wing during the party. No one wants the dowager vibe tonight." And her son-in-law, Preston, had laughed into his vodka rocks and added, "Honestly, Celeste, the average age drops 50 years when you leave the room." The laughter followed her into the mirrored elevator like cigarette smoke. She watched her reflection descend 44 floors and decided, right there between the 32nd and the 31st, that she would never again ride up. She stepped into the October night on East 73rd and raised one gloved hand. A yellow cab slid forward as if it had been waiting for her since 1974, the year she closed on the apartment with the proceeds of her late husband's life insurance and her own 28 years as senior trusts and estates paralegal at Davis Polk. "The Plaza," she said, voice steady, the way she used to pronounce judgments on sloppy transfer documents. The driver met her eyes in the mirror and nodded once, sensing royalty in exile. At the Plaza, she took the smallest suite on the 5th floor overlooking the park because it reminded her of the first hotel room she and Edward ever shared, back when they were young and believed love could be leased by the night. She hung the navy coat in the closet, placed the Kelly bag on the desk like a loaded weapon, and opened the blue envelope. The deed was still perfect. Crisp corners, her name alone on the grantee line. Celeste Margaret Harrington, an unmarried woman. No co-op board approval needed in 1974, no child's name added for convenience, no trust, no strings, just hers. She ran one finger across the raised seal of the city register and felt the old power return to her bones like blood after a tourniquet is cut. She poured 2 fingers of the Macallan the hotel had left as a welcome and dialed a number she had not used since Edward's funeral. Malcolm Weinberg, of counsel at Davis Polk, retired but still feared in 3 states, answered on the second ring. "Celeste?" His voice carried the same courtroom baritone that once made junior associates wet themselves. "It's nearly 10 o'clock. "I know what time it is, Malcolm. I need the co-op's stock certificate and proprietary lease messengered to me first thing tomorrow, the originals, and I need building security on standby at 9 sharp. A pause, then the rustle of a man sitting upright in bed. "May I ask why?" "Because my daughter and her husband have forgotten whose name is on the certificate. I intend to remind them, quietly." Malcolm exhaled through his teeth. "I'll have Julian bring them himself. And Celeste?" "Yes." "It's good to hear you sound dangerous again." She slept better than she had in 3 years. No guest wing mattress that sagged in the middle, no bass from Preston's curated party playlist thumping through the walls, only the hush of Central Park South traffic 40 stories down. At 7:30 the next morning, Julian Knapp, Malcolm's tallest and most silent associate, appeared with a leather folder and a Starbucks she hadn't asked for. She signed for the documents, slipped the stock certificate and the proprietary lease into the Tiffany envelope beside the deed, and dressed for war. Charcoal slacks with a knife crease, ivory silk blouse, the triple-strand pearls Edward gave her the day Victoria was born, and the same navy coat because it was armor now. At 8:15, she was in a black town car idling across the street from her building. She watched Carlos open the door for a delivery of 20 cases of Veuve Clicquot. "Party tonight," Victoria had bragged on Instagram. "Influencers, bottle service, the usual circus." Perfect. At exactly 9 o'clock, Carlos received a call from building management. His face changed. He glanced up and down the street, confused, then disappeared inside. 30 seconds later, the freight elevator opened and 2 uniformed security officers stepped out, followed by Malcolm in a 3-piece suit sharp enough to shave with. Celeste crossed the street, heels clicking like a metronome. Carlos saw her coming and froze. "Mrs. Harrington, She cut him off with the smallest lift of one eyebrow, the same look that once made lying executors confess. The officers fell in behind her like an honor guard. The private elevator required a key. She produced it from the Kelly bag, inserted it herself, and pressed PH. The ride up took 14 seconds. She spent them rehearsing the single sentence she had decided on sometime around 3 a.m. The door slid open directly into the marble foyer she had chosen herself in 1974. Kurarmarn, pale gray veins like winter lightning. Victoria was on the telephone shrieking about orchid centerpieces. Preston lounged on the Biedermeier sofa in a silk robe, scrolling his phone, hair still wet from the shower. Neither noticed the elevator chime until Celeste stepped into the living room and the two security officers took positions flanking the archway. Victoria turned first. The phone slipped from her manicured fingers and clattered on the marble. "Mother?" The word came out small, almost childish. Preston looked up, smirked, then registered the uniforms and the lawyer and the mother he had dismissed as decorative. The smirk died. Celeste placed the Tiffany blue envelope on the George III tea table Edward had shipped from London the year Thatcher took power. "Victoria, Preston, this is a notice terminating your license to occupy my residence. You have until 6 o'clock this evening to remove yourselves and your personal belongings." She spoke quietly, the way judges speak when they have already decided. Victoria laughed, high and brittle. "You're joking. This is our home." "No," she corrected gently, "it is my home. You have been guests who forgot to leave." Preston stood, tying the robe tighter, trying for authority and achieving only bathhouse panic. "You can't do this. We've lived here almost 5 years. There are rights." Malcolm stepped forward and placed a thing folder on the table. "Adverse possession requires open, hostile, exclusive, and continuous possession for 10 years in New York, Mr. Whitmore. You have none of those. Mrs. Harrington has resided continuously, paid all maintenance and taxes solely, and now objects, strenuously." Preston's face went the color of skim milk. Victoria lunged for the envelope, but one of the officers moved half a step and she thought better. "You're doing this because of last night? Because we asked you to stay in the guest wing for one party?" Celeste met her daughter's eyes and felt something inside her chest lock into place like the bolt on a vault. "I am doing this because last night you told the mother who carried you for 9 months and paid every bill you have ever incurred that she lowers the average age when she leaves the room. I have decided to raise it again, permanently." Preston tried bluster. "We'll sue. Emotional distress, elder abuse." Malcolm's laugh was soft and terrible. "Please do. Discovery will be fascinating, especially the American Express bills in Mrs. Harrington's name for Mykonos, Gstaad, and the down payment on the Tesla registered to you but titled to her." Preston's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Nothing came out. Celeste walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the park. The leaves were turning, the reservoir a sheet of hammered copper in the morning light. She had chosen this view the day Edward died, had stood right here and promised herself she would never be dispossessed again. She turned back. 6 o'clock. Anything left behind will be donated to Housing Works. The locks will be changed at 6:01. Victoria was crying now, mascara tracking black rivers down cheeks that had never known a single unpaid bill. "Where are we supposed to go?" Celeste considered the question with genuine calm. "I neither know nor care. You are 42 years old, Victoria. Time to find out how the rest of the world lives." She walked past them toward the master suite to collect the few things she wanted. The photograph of Edward on the bedside table, the small Fragonard sketch, the emerald earrings he gave her on their 30th anniversary. Behind her she heard Preston hiss, "This is insane! We'll fight it!" And Victoria sob, "She can't! She can't!" Malcolm's voice cut through like a scalpel. "She can, she has, and she will." In the bedroom, she paused at the threshold. The bed was unmade, Victoria's silk eye mask still on the pillow, Preston's monogrammed slippers kicked halfway across the Aubuchon rug she and Edward had bought in Paris in 1981. She felt no nostalgia, only the clean relief of a ledger finally balanced. She took the photograph, the sketch, the earrings, and nothing else. When she returned to the living room, 2 more security officers had arrived with flattened boxes. Preston was on the phone, pacing, shouting at someone about emergency injunctions. Victoria sat on the sofa, clutching a throw pillow like a life raft. Celeste paused beside her daughter. "The maintenance is paid through the end of the month," she said quietly.
After that, the board will need new shareholders to approve any transfer. I have instructed Malcolm to vote my shares against you permanently." Victoria looked up, eyes swollen. "I hate you," she whispered. Celeste absorbed the words the way she once absorbed insults from spoiled heirs in settlement conferences. "No, darling, you hate that I finally set it back." She rode the elevator down with Malcolm and the original officers. Carlos held the door, eyes wide, unsure whether to call her Mrs. Harrington, or Ma'am, or Your Majesty. She gave him the smallest smile. "Carlos, please ensure the Whitmore's names are removed from the approved guest list by noon, and have the florist deliver white orchids to the lobby tomorrow. I always preferred orchids." He nodded as if receiving orders from a general. Outside, the town car waited. Malcolm held the door. "Lunch?" he asked. "Le Bernardin," she said. "And then I think I'll look at a smaller place on Fifth, something with a terrace. I suddenly have a taste for gardening." Malcolm chuckled. "The city will never recover." That evening at 6:01, the locks were changed by a bonded locksmith who owed Malcolm a favor from 1993. At 6:15, Celeste stood alone in the penthouse for the first time in 5 years. She opened every window to let the cold October air scour the rooms clean. She walked from the foyer to the library, to the kitchen where the Sub-Zero still hummed with someone else's caviar and champagne. She poured herself one glass from a bottle Preston had been saving for the party and toasted the empty rooms. "To boundaries," she said aloud. The crystal rang like a bell. She slept that night in her own bed for the first time since Victoria and Preston had arrived with their Louis Vuitton suitcases and their promises of "just 6 months, Mummy, until the fund is liquid." She slept 12 hours without waking, dreamless and deep. In the morning, she called the broker who had sold her the apartment in 1974. "Marlene, darling, I'm ready to list. Quietly. No open houses. Cash buyers only. And Marlene," a pause, "price it as if the daughter never existed." 3 weeks later, the penthouse sold to a lovely violinist couple from the Philharmonic who gasped at the light and asked if they might keep the Fragonard sketch because it reminded them of their honeymoon in Paris. Celeste left it for them, along with a bottle of 1996 Krug and a note that read, "Play loudly, the walls are thick and the neighbors are gone." She moved into a sun-drenched pre-war on Fifth, with a terrace big enough for roses, and a doorman who called her Madame Celeste without irony. Every Thursday, she hosted what the widows on the Upper East Side came to call Celeste's Salon: tea, macarons from Lattery, and merciless advice on revocable trusts, separate bank accounts, and how to change the locks before anyone notices you're serious. Attendance grew. White orchids arrived anonymously every week. No one discovered who sent them. Victoria called once, 6 months later, voice small from a studio in Murray Hill. "I filed for divorce. I got a job, real one, benefits and everything." Celeste listened to the city traffic behind her daughter's words and felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't known was still knotted. "Would you like to come for tea on Thursday? 4 o'clock. Bring your own key. You won't need mine anymore." On the first Thursday in spring, Victoria arrived wearing no makeup and carrying a small, respectful plant instead of designer luggage. They sat on the terrace when the roses bloomed blood red against the skyline. Victoria looked at the view and whispered, "I'm sorry." Celeste poured Darjeeling into porcelain cups so thin that they were almost transparent. "I know," she said. "Now drink your tea before it cools. We have documents to review. You're going to need a will of your own." And somewhere across the park, in an empty penthouse that no longer belonged to any of them, white orchids stood in crystal vases waiting for new music to fill the rooms, where an old woman had finally, quietly turned the volume back up to exactly where she wanted it. The first Thursday in May, the terrace doors stood open, and the roses had begun their reckless climb over the balustrade, blood red against the pale stone, exactly the way Celeste had planned when she signed the contract on the new apartment. The salon had grown, now 8 women, all over 65, all carrying folders thick with bank statements they had finally asked to see, all wearing the particular brightness when fear loosens its fingers one by one. Victoria arrived last, still in the navy suit she wore to her new job at a non-profit that helped women rebuild credit after divorce. She carried a modest orchid in a terracotta pot and hesitated at the threshold as if the old habit of asking permission still clung to her shoes. Celeste met her eyes across the room and gave the smallest nod. No drama, no embrace in front of the others, just the quiet acknowledgement that the daughter had come as a guest and would leave as an adult. Victoria set the orchid beside its white cousins and took the empty chair between Miriam Rothstein, who had just revoked her son's power of attorney, and Eleanor Park, who had discovered her daughter-in-law had been siphoning the maintenance account for Pilates retreats. Celeste rang the small silver bell she had bought in Kyoto in 1987, and the room hushed the way courtrooms used to hush when she laid the final exhibit on counsel table. "Ladies," she began, voice low but carrying to the farthest chaise, "today we are going to discuss the single most powerful sentence you will ever say to an adult child who believes your money is your birthright. The sentence is short. It has only 9 words. Repeat after me. I am not prepared to discuss that at this time." 8 voices rose in perfect murderous unison. The sentence floated out over Fifth Avenue like a gauntlet thrown down to every ungrateful heir south of 96th Street. Celeste allowed herself one small smile. "Excellent. Practice it in the mirror. Practice it in the taxi. Practice it until it tastes like freedom." She passed around a fresh folder, peach-colored this time, because peach had become her signature color of victory, and inside were sample letters she had drafted for each of them: polite, lethal, terminating access to safe deposit boxes, canceling names from brokerage accounts, canceling the American Express supplementary cards that had funded St. Bart's Villas and Hermes sample sales. Miriam Rothstein actually laughed out loud when she read the line about returning the Tiffany keyring, or its full retail value will be deducted from any future inheritance. Eleanor Park clutched the page to her chest as if it were the Gettysburg Address. Victoria listened without comment, but Celeste noticed her daughter's pen moving steadily across her own legal pad, writing down every date and clause number as though she were still the little girl who used to copy her mother's Christmas card list in perfect Palmer penmanship. When the others broke for more,
The sentence landed between them like a perfectly executed pirouette. Celeste felt something bloom in her chest that was not quite pride and not quite forgiveness, but the clean, level ground where mothers and daughters can finally stand as equals. That evening, after the last guest had gone and the terrace lights came on, casting soft pools across the roses, Celeste poured herself a finger of Macallan and opened the peach folder to a fresh page. At the top, she wrote in her neat paralegal hand, "The Penthouse Violinists, Update." Beneath it, she noted that the young couple had hung the Fragonard in the exact spot above the fireplace where it had always belonged, that they practiced Bach partitas at 7 every morning, that the board had voted unanimously to waive the no piano rule because the sound floated down the air shaft like a blessing. She underlined the word blessing twice. Then she turned to a blank page and began a new list titled Phase 2. Item 1, purchase the vacant 2-bedroom on the 3rd floor of her building, quiet elderly doctor moving to Florida, asking price ridiculously low. Item 2, convert it into short-term furnished rentals for women attending the salon who needed a safe place to land while they changed locks and rewrote wills. Item 3, hire Roman Cruz, Malcolm's terrifyingly competent junior associate, to set up a non-profit entity to be called the Celeste Harrington Downdry Foundation. Seed money, the proceeds from the sale of the penthouse, minus the cost of the new apartment and the terrace roses. She paused at item 4, pen hovering, then wrote, invite Victoria to serve as treasurer. Salary modest, dignity non-negotiable. The city glittered beyond the terrace like a promise kept.
Somewhere across the park, Preston was probably rage-scrolling on whatever couch he had landed on, discovering that the world did not, in fact, owe him bottle service and a view of the reservoir. Victoria was walking home to her own Murray Hill studio, carrying leftovers in Tupperware and the beginnings of a 5-year financial plan. And Celeste sat in the warm May darkness, listening to the faint sound of a violin drifting up from a penthouse that no longer belonged to her and never really had to anyone else. She raised her glass to the night. "To the next chapter," she said aloud. The roses rustled in agreement. Somewhere below, a taxi honked, a siren wailed, a doorman whistled for a cab. Ordinary New York music that belonged to everyone and no one. She finished the whiskey, set the glass down with a soft click, and went inside to close the terrace doors exactly when she felt like it, not a minute sooner, not a minute later. The locks turned smoothly, the keys were warm in her hand, and for the first time in her entire life, Celeste Harrington went to bed knowing that tomorrow the volume, the light, the guest list, and the very air she breathed would be tuned precisely to the measure of her own heart.
Upstairs in the apartment, she hung the navy cashmere coat in its rightful place, poured a nightcap she didn't particularly want, and stepped onto the terrace. The asters had given way to the first hardy mums, deep bronze against the stone. Somewhere across the park, a violin practiced scales, steady and sure. Celeste raised her glass to the darkness, to the roses that would return in spring, to the women sleeping safely on the 3rd floor, and the dozens more who would follow. She thought of the green velvet armchair she had never bothered to replace in the old penthouse, of the remote control that finally belonged only to the hand that paid for the electricity, of the 9-word sentence that had become a quiet anthem across 3 states. Then she drank the whiskey in one slow sip, set the glass down with its familiar soft click, and went inside to close the terrace doors exactly when she felt like it. The locks turned smoothly. The keys were warm in her palm, and somewhere in the city a new light went on in a room that had once been a cage, and an old woman somewhere else whispered 9 words to the darkness and discovered, perhaps for the first time in her life, that silence could sound exactly like freedom. November settled over the city like a velvet curtain, the park stripped to its elegant bones and the foundation's 3rd floor perpetually scented with cinnamon and printer toner. The guest book now held 93 names, some staying only long enough to sign a new lease and cancel an old life, others lingering through the holidays because the thought of Thanksgiving with people who still expected them to cook the turkey and clean the dishes was suddenly unthinkable. Celeste had installed a second coffee station and a discreet brass plaque by the elevator that read simply, "Safe Harbor." No one ever asked what the harbor was safe from. They already knew. On the first Tuesday in December, a snowstorm swept in from the northeast, and the salon moved indoors to the living room, chairs arranged in a loose circle around the fireplace where a modest stack of birch logs burned with perfect manners. The women arrived in furs and fury, cheeks red from the wind and from stories they had never dared tell before. One had discovered her son forging her signature on a reverse mortgage application. Another had come home from the hospital after a heart scare to find the locks changed and a post-it on the door reading, "Airbnb guest arriving tonight, keys under mat." Celeste listened the way she once listened to witnesses on the stand. No visible reaction, every detail filed away for later use. When the last tale was told, she stood, smoothed the front of her peach cashmere sweater, and said only, "We begin with the locks. Roman has a man on speed dial 24 hours a day. Then we freeze the accounts. Then we drink something stronger than tea." No one argued. Victoria had taken to wearing the foundation's peach stationery like armor. She could draft a cease and desist in the time it took most people to find their reading glasses. That evening, Victoria handed Celeste a thick envelope postmarked Dubai. Inside was a 12-page letter from Preston, handwritten on 4 Seasons stationery, alternating between tearful remorse and barely veiled threats to expose the foundation as elder abuse. Victoria's note was clipped to the front. "I read it so you don't have to. Recommendation, shred, then use as kindling." Celeste did exactly that, watching Preston's looping scrawl curl and blacken in the fireplace while 8 women raised their glasses of Barolo in solemn approval. Christmas came and went without drama for the first time in 50 years. Celeste decorated a single fir on the terrace with white lights and nothing else. The simplicity felt like penance and celebration at once. On Christmas Eve, the violinists arrived with sheet music and a bottle of 1982 Chateau d'Yquem they claimed to have found at auction. They played carols while snow drifted past the windows, and the women on the third floor stood on their small balconies wrapped in borrowed robes, listening to Silent Night rise 40 stories above the city. One of them, a retired Latin teacher from Greenwich named Constance, wept openly because it was the first Christmas Eve in 37 years that no one had asked her to stuff a goose at 5 in the morning. In January, the foundation received its first anonymous 7-figure donation, wired from a trust in the Caymans, with instructions to keep buying locks and peach stationery. Celeste and Victoria spent an entire weekend trying to trace it before deciding some miracles were better left unexamined. They used the money to purchase the vacant studio next door to Safe Harbor and convert it into a law clinic staffed by 2 newly minted attorneys who believed boundaries were a civil right. Roman Cruz took to calling them his junior Avengers. February brought the trial of the reverse mortgage son. Celeste sat in the back of the courtroom in her navy coat, watching the prosecutor lay out forgery counts while the son's attorney tried to argue diminished capacity on the part of an 83-year-old woman who had just recited the Gettysburg Address from memory for the judge. When the guilty verdict came down, the women of the Thursday Salon were waiting outside with a single white orchid and a card that read, "The guest wing is officially closed." The son's mother did not smile, but her spine straightened 2 full inches, and she walked out of 100 Center Street into a future she finally owned. Spring returned with its reckless promises, and the roses returned blood-red and insolent. The foundation celebrated its first anniversary with a party on the terrace that spilled down the fire stairs to the 3rd floor and into the clinic. Someone hung a banner across the balustrade that read, "Boundaries look good on you," in peach block letters visible from Central Park. Malcolm made a speech that lasted exactly 90 seconds and ended with him handing Celeste a small velvet box. Inside was the brass plaque from Safe Harbor, now engraved on the back, "To Celeste Margaret Harrington, who taught us that the most revolutionary act an old woman can commit is to close a door softly but permanently." She kept it on her desk beside the Kyoto Bell and the ever-growing stack of thank you letters written in shaky, grateful hands. Victoria moved into the studio next door to the clinic, a place so small she had to turn sideways to open the refrigerator, and declared it the first home that had ever been entirely hers. She hung a single photograph on the wall, the 2 of them on the terrace the night of the Boundary dinner, arms linked, city lights behind them like scattered diamonds. Some evenings she cooked pasta for one and carried it upstairs to eat with her mother while they reviewed the day's victories. They spoke of everything except the years that came before. Some silences are kinder than words. On a soft evening in May, exactly 18 months after she had stepped out of the Penthouse elevator carrying only a Kelly bag and a deed, Celeste stood alone on the terrace watching the park turn that particular shade of green that happens only once a year. The foundation now owned the entire 3rd floor outright, the clinic had a 2-month waiting list, and the Thursday Salon had spawned sister gatherings in Boston, Chicago, and Palm Beach. She wore the same navy coat because some armor never goes out of style, and she held a glass of the 1982 d'Yquem the violinists had left half-finished the previous Christmas. Somewhere below, a new arrival was being handed a key that opened only her own door and a cup of coffee that belonged to no one but herself. Celeste raised the glass to the darkening sky, to the women who learned late and to the daughters who learned in time. The roses rustled. Far across the park, a violin began the slow ascent of the lark ascending again, the same notes that marked the night the locks were changed forever. She listened until the last note drifted away on the warm air, then turned and went inside. The terrace doors closed with their familiar soft click. The locks turned smoothly. The keys were warm in her hand. And in apartments and townhouses and cottages all over the city, women of a certain age heard that click in their dreams and woke up knowing exactly what to do next.
Preston took one involuntary step back. "I apologized for that. I was drunk." Celeste turned, pearls catching the light like small moons. You were not drunk, you were accurate. I did lower the average age. I also paid the maintenance, the taxes, the Veuve Clicquot, and the Tesla you wrapped around a tree in Bridgehampton. Accuracy has consequences. The women murmured approval, a low, satisfied hum. Preston's eyes darted to the elevator, but Miriam Rothenstein had quietly positioned her walker across the doorway. He was trapped in a room full of grandmothers who had learned to bite. He tried again, voice cracking. I just need a place to stay. 30 days, I'll be out of your hair. Celeste walked to the kitchen pass-through where Constance had left the peach cobbler cooling. She picked up the server, cut a perfect square, and slid it onto a plate. Do you know what this is? She asked conversationally. Preston blinked. Cobbler? Wrong, she said. This is what women bake when they no longer have to cook for men who call them dowager in their own homes. She set the plate down untouched. You may not have 30 seconds, let alone 30 days. Victoria stepped forward, holding a second document. This is a trespass notice drafted by Roman Cruz, effective the moment you stepped off the elevator. Security is already on their way up. Preston's face crumpled, the last of the charb draining away like dirty water. You can't do this to me. Celeste met his eyes, and for the first time in all the years she had known him, she let him see the full measure of what he had mistaken for softness. We already have, she said. The elevator dinged. 2 building security officers appeared, polite but immovable. Preston looked once at Victoria, once at Celeste, and understood that every door he had ever walked through uninvited was now closed forever. He left without another word, shoulders folded inward like a man carrying his own coffin. The room exhaled as one. Someone started clapping, slow and deliberate, and within seconds, every woman was on her feet, applause rolling through the apartment and out onto the terrace where the roses stood witness. Celeste lifted both hands, palms out, and the sound stopped instantly. Ladies, she said, voice trembling just slightly, that was the last ghost in this house. From now on, we only open doors for people who knock. She picked up the untouched square of cobbler, carried it to the terrace, and crumbled it over the railing for the pigeons. Even the birds get more than he does, she said, and the laughter that followed was bright enough to rival the June sun. That night, Victoria stayed late, helping stack chairs and wash teacups while the city cooled outside the open windows. When the last dish was dried, she leaned against the counter and looked at her mother with something that had finally settled into uncomplicated love. I keep waiting to feel sorry for him, she said quietly. Celeste dried her hands on a linen towel and considered. Pity is a luxury we can't afford when we're still paying interest on old pain. Let it go. We have work to do. Victoria nodded, understanding completely. They stood in silence for a moment, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a siren, ordinary city music that now belonged only to people who paid their own bills. Before she left, Victoria paused at the door. Mother, she said, do you ever think about forgiveness? Celeste thought of the penthouse, the guest wing, the night she walked out with nothing but a deed and a spine made of steel. She thought of every woman who had slept on the 3rd floor and woken up unafraid. Forgiveness, she said at last, is what you offer someone who has stopped trespassing. He hasn't. Not yet. Victoria smiled, small and fierce. Then we keep the locks. Exactly, Celeste answered. We keep the locks. Later, alone on the terrace with the roses and the city lights spread out like a promise she had finally learned to trust, Celeste poured one last glass of the 1982 Yquem and raised it to the dark. To closed doors, she whispered, and to every woman still learning how to turn the key. Somewhere below, a new arrival turned off her bedside lamp, whispering the 9-word sentence into her pillow like a prayer. Somewhere across the park, a violin began the slow ascent of the lark ascending again, steady and unafraid. Celeste listened until the final note dissolved into summer air, then went inside, closed the terrace doors with their familiar soft click, and slept the dreamless sleep of a woman who had finally, irrevocably, come home to herself. July shimmered into August, and the city turned into a slow-moving river of heat, but the foundation kept its cool. The 3rd floor now had a waiting list, and the peach stationery had been reordered in bulk from a printer in Connecticut who asked no questions and simply added a line of tiny locked doors along the bottom edge as a private joke. Celeste celebrated her 77th birthday on a Thursday that broke every attendance record. The terrace overflowed, the living room overflowed, even the clinic's waiting area overflowed, with women holding slices of Constance's peach cobbler on paper plates and singing happy birthday in keys that refused to apologize. Malcolm arrived with a bottle of 1961 Latour and a deed in a peach folder. The board's back had quietly voted to name the third floor the Celeste Harrington Safe Harbor Wing in perpetuity, rent-free, untouchable by any future board or greedy heir. He handed her the fountain pen she had used to sign her own divorce papers 43 years earlier, and she signed the acceptance without flourish, as though receiving something she had simply been waiting to collect. Victoria marked the occasion by moving out of the tiny studio and into a sunny one-bedroom on West End Avenue she had bought with her own money and a mortgage in her own name. Closing day fell on the same afternoon Preston's final appeal was dismissed in Dubai for want of prosecution, a detail Roman delivered with the same neutral tone he used to order lunch. She hosted her first housewarming on a Sunday in late August. The new apartment smelled of fresh paint and possibility. The walls were bare except for the photograph from the boundary dinner and a small brass plaque Celeste had given her that read, "The locks stay with the owner." The Thursday regulars came bearing orchids and legal-sized envelopes full of advice they no longer needed for themselves, but were happy to pass along. When the last guest left, Victoria stood alone on her own balcony for the first time and realized she was not afraid of the quiet. September brought an unexpected letter forwarded from the old Penthouse address, a single sheet of heavy stock, no return address, postmarked Zurich. The handwriting was Edward's, unmistakable even after 15 years. Celeste recognized it before she opened the envelope and felt her heart pause the way it had the morning the doorman called to say Mr. Harrington had collapsed on the squash court. Inside was one page dated the week before he died, placed in a trust with instructions to deliver it to her on the 10th anniversary of the Penthouse sale, or when she finally takes the apartment back, whichever comes first. She read it standing in the kitchen while the kettle screamed unnoticed. My dearest Celeste, if you are reading this, I am gone, and you have done what I always knew you would. You have reclaimed what is yours. I put the penthouse in your name alone because I knew one day your daughter might love badly, and you would need a fortress. Be fierce with it. Be gentle with her when she deserves it. You were always the stronger of us. I simply had the luck to marry you before you realized it. Spend the view on yourself. All my love, always, Edward. She read it twice, folded it along its original creases, and slipped it into the peach folder she kept locked in her desk. Then she poured the forgotten tea, carried it to the terrace, and watched the sun set over the park Edward had loved from 44 floors up. She did not cry. The letter had not asked for tears, only for continuation. October arrived crisp and decisive. The foundation launched its first satellite in Chicago, funded by the anonymous Piemans donor who had finally revealed herself as Lillian Adler, the woman who had once been relegated to the maid's room. She had sold the Park Avenue apartment for $28 million and wanted every cent to buy more locks and peach stationery. The Thursday salon celebrated with champagne on the terrace, while the roses made their last defiant stand against autumn. Someone proposed a toast to absent ghosts and forgiven mistakes, and someone else added, and to the men who taught us exactly how strong we are by being so spectacularly weak. Glasses rose, laughter scattered into the night, and for one moment the city itself seemed to lean in and listen. On a quiet Tuesday in November, Celeste walked alone to the corner of 73rd and 5th, where the old buildings still stood, white-gloved doorman and all. Carlos was no longer on duty. A younger man tipped his cap and called her ma'am. She crossed the street, looked up at the penthouse windows glowing gold against the dusk, and saw the Fragonard sketch exactly where the violinists had hung it. Elena was practicing. The faint thread of a Brahms sonata drifted down 44 floors and wrapped itself like a scarf. She stood there until the music ended, then turned and walked home without looking back. That evening, she opened the peach folder one last time and added a new page titled Instructions Upon My Death. It was short. The foundation would continue in perpetuity, Victoria as executive director, Malcolm's firm as perpetual counsel, the third floor never to be sold or subdivided.
The terrace roses were to be maintained by whatever woman needed the work most. And finally, bury me in the navy cashmere coat. It carried me out, it can carry me home. She signed it Celeste Margaret Harrington, founder, underlined founder once, and locked the folder away. Winter settled in with its particular hush. The salon moved back to the living room, the fire burned low and steady, and the women kept arriving, some in wheelchairs, some in Chanel, all carrying the same stunned gratitude of people who had discovered that the rest of their life could begin on a random Thursday in December. Celeste presided from the same chair she had bought the week Edward died, the Kyoto bell on the table beside her, the brass plaque from Safe Harbor catching the firelight whenever someone new read it aloud and understood what it meant.